we admitted we were powerless and our lives had become unmanageable.
Good morning. I am Pastor Mike, and today we are going to continue our series, 12 Words. This summer series, we're exploring how the 12-step program can kind of give us a framework and help us experience Christ-like transformation in our lives. And throughout it, what we're really doing is we're distilling each of these 12 steps down to just one word that we believe captures its foundational spiritual principle. Now, last Sunday, we really dug deep. We kicked off this sermon and we laid out the what and the why of this sermon series. So I'd highly recommend listening to that last sermon on YouTube. If you missed it, it's going to fill in a lot of gaps. But as a reminder, or if you did miss it, what we're going to be doing throughout this series, we're going to be really relying upon three central premises. First, that the modern understanding of this word addiction is a good metaphor and an accurate metaphor for what the Bible calls sin, this universal spiritual disease that is baked into our human nature, that's made all of us in some way, shape, or form into addicts. That is, people who just keep repeating the same compulsions, cycles, or insanities, all while expecting different results. At the very least, I posit that we all share at least the one universal human addiction to what Richard Rohr calls our own stinking thinking. That is, to our own patterned ways of thinking and living that we go about considering 100% right, that we blindly rely upon for our daily decision-making, even when it's clear from an outside perspective that it is not working. That's not getting us where we want to go. No one here struggles with that, I'm sure. Second, premise number two, the spiritual principles of the 12 steps mirror Jesus' own teachings on holistic salvation and spiritual growth. Thus, we believe that seeking recovery or healing through these steps can be a helpful tool for experiencing Christian life change or learning how to tangibly and practically follow Jesus better. And finally, premise number three, the 12 steps goal isn't simply sin management. Its goal is not to just give us abstinence from a substance or a compulsion. Rather, as a spiritual program, these steps want to guide us into a vital spiritual experience through a renewed, transformative connection with a loving God who has the power to heal our deepest areas of brokenness and give us true, abundant life. These are the premises, like I said, that are going to guide us this series. So with these in mind, let us begin this journey, which actually starts in what I find to be an unexpected place. That is, this journey begins with an admission of absolute and utter defeat. Or, as step one puts it, we admitted we are powerless over alcohol, that our lives had become unmanageable. Or we admitted, for the sake of our series, in just one word, that we were powerless. Which is an interesting step, right? Because what we see is it's actually a step that has two parts. First, we had to admit that we are powerless over one thing, right? For the case of alcoholics, it's alcohol, but it really could be any other compulsion, addiction, habit, or pattern that we simply can't stop doing. Which then leads us to admit more broadly that actually we're powerless over everything else too. Yay! And I call this an unexpected beginning because let's be real, no one naturally believes that defeat or losing marks the start of anything good. No, we tend, when left to our own devices, to view such admissions as tragic events. That's obvious in our storytelling. For example, who sees this picture and thinks of victory? No, you guys know what this movie is, right? Oh my gosh, how old am I? No one applauds at the death of Apollo Creed by Ivan Drago in Rocky IV. This is one of the most devastating endings and defeats in movie history. And then there's, of course, our sports. Who remembers this one? This is a great moment. This is the end of Alabama-Auburn, a truly great rivalry. Alabama is tied up the game. They could send it to overtime, but Nick Saban argued for one more second on the clock to kick a long field goal. And right before he kicks it, the announcer says, by the way, they could return this kick, so Alabama better be careful. Oh, no. Well, he'll get him. Well, the next guy's going to get him. Well, the next... Oh, no. Oh, look at Nick Saban's face coming up. Okay, so maybe that's a poor example because lol, Bama, go Gators, but I imagine for Bama fans, this is a really devastating loss. It's probably not one that they look at as a positive life experience. But that face. But joking aside, this is also true for serious events too. Like this famous photo of the fall of Saigon, right? The iconic image of America's defeat in the Vietnam War. No American textbook that I ever read in school held this up as a victorious image. This was not presented to me as a photo of what it means to win. Because, again, admitting defeat isn't something we naturally call good, desirable, nor is it something that we, left to our own devices, would claim that we ever need. And yet, the 12 steps believe that recovery must begin with this admission of defeat, this admission of powerlessness. In fact, it's taught that this first step is the only step of all the 12 that one must get 100% right from the start if they have any hope of getting well. And Jesus, interestingly enough, believed this too. You can see it across his teachings. In fact, you could see it in his most fundamental conviction that somehow, some way, it was through dying on a Roman cross, what the world called defeat for a king, that somehow, some way, this defeat is what achieved victory over evil, sin, and death. That is what his whole ministry was building to. Like the 12 steps, victory through defeat, power through surrender. Y'all, these are fundamental truths for Jesus across the Gospels. And thus, I want to make sure that we get this critical first step in word right. And specifically, I want to do that by exploring what's become one of my favorite New Testament passages from the book of 2 Corinthians, this letter that the Apostle Paul, a really important first century church leader, wrote to the Christian community in the Roman city of Corinth. And y'all, let me just tell you, the Corinthian church was, frankly, a dumpster fire. Because the Corinthians, you see, like their Roman world, they had adopted this obsession with status, power, and strength, which had led them to create these factions within their communities around toxic leaders who called themselves the super apostles, which is a really lame name, I know. But anyway, super apostles who'd risen to prominence in this church by using this Roman practice called boasting, this ancient form of propaganda deployed by politicians and generals and philosophers to gain followers. You see, when one would boast in this culture, they would publicly proclaim these long lists of their victories, accomplishments, etc., highlighting their strength over and against some rival's weaknesses. The goal being that they'll convince his followers to abandon him and come follow you instead. A strategy that, what we can tell from the Corinthian letters, these super apostles were using to undermine Paul and promote themselves as the church's rightful leaders, mocking everything from his poverty to his low status to his oration skills to his frail physical appearance, while boasting that their own power, status, strength, and lack of defeats proved them to be superior spiritual people, superior followers of Jesus. And what's wild is that apparently this strategy was working. The Corinthians were slowly but surely starting to move towards this worldview of strength and might and power of the super apostles over against the gospel that Paul had taught them. And thus, Paul, he must respond, right? The church's soul is at stake. So, in chapter 11, verse 21, we see Paul do so. And he does so in an interesting way. He begins his own boast. We read this: Whatever anyone else dares to boast about, I am speaking as a fool. I also dare to boast about. Are they Hebrews? So am I. Israelites? So am I. Abraham's descendants? So am I. Are they servants of Christ? I am out of my mind to talk like this. I am more. Okay, so let's briefly pause, because understand that this opening, it mirrors a classic Roman boast. We see Paul declaring, rather brashly, that he has every trait of a disciple of Jesus that these super apostles claim, but more, right? And thus, what we should expect next, if this were to be a classic Roman boast, is that we should expect him to start providing evidence of this claim. Basically, a list of his victories, his strengths, his successes, a highlight reel, if you will, for why he's a far more worthy person when it comes to praise, power, etc. Except, instead, Paul does the opposite. He turns everything upside down. I want you to check this out. I have worked much harder, been in prison more frequently, been flogged more severely, and exposed to death again and again. 5 times I received from the Jews the 40 lashes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was pelted with stones. 3 times I was shipwrecked. I spent a night and a day in the open sea. I have been constantly on the move. I have been in danger from rivers, from bandits, from my fellow Jews, from Gentiles, in danger in the city, in the country, at sea, in danger from false believers. I've labored and toiled and have often gone without sleep. I have known hunger and thirst and have often gone without food. I have been cold and naked. Besides everything else, I face daily pressure of my concern for all the churches. Who is weak, and I do not feel weak? Who is led into sin, and I do not inwardly burn? If I must boast, I will boast of the things that show my what? My weakness. So Paul's evidence for why he's a superior Christian to these prideful, boasting super apostles is this list, not of his greatest victories, but of his greatest defeats. The times in his life when he was beaten, imprisoned, stranded, hungry, left destitute, homeless, cold, naked, left helpless. In other words, Paul responds to accusations that he's weak by boasting about the experiences which prove that to be true. Saying, in effect, you want proof that I follow Jesus? Let me tell you about my greatest humiliations. The very things you claim are my shame. The times where I was revealed to be, in front of everyone, not powerful, but utterly and completely defeated, weak, powerless. Which would have been, baffling, right, for these Corinthians, these people drenched in Roman values of strength, superiority. Everything Paul lists here would have been considered absolutely demeaning for anyone who claimed social status. The very things that the super apostles likely mocked about Paul. But in that, we also see, I think, Paul's true genius, because in that, he's making a pretty shocking claim. That the sign of a true apostle, a true disciple of Jesus, is found not in someone's ability to hide or deny their defeats, their brokenness, their weakness, their powerlessness. No. It's found instead in their ability to name them, to admit them, to accept them. Which again, would have sounded insane to anyone in this culture. Heck, it sounds insane to anyone within our American culture, right? Who in this American culture, if they wanted elected office, would get up and say, I am a schmuck. I have done everything wrong. I have been exposed to completely incompetent. I am weak. I am powerless. I have failed over and over again. Who would do that and expect you to get their vote? No one. Because our culture values what? It values power, control, might. And yet this is Paul's conviction, this upside down belief that no. It's the opposite that's true. It's the opposite that we should be looking for in a disciple of Jesus. And then in the next chapter, what I think is one of the coolest paragraphs in the entire New Testament, we see Paul explaining why he thinks this is true. Where, after describing his own brokenness, this thing in his life he just can't get rid of, his own powerlessness, Paul writes this, "But God said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong." Y'all, that's not someone who views admitting weakness as a cause for shame. No. That's someone who sees that in hindsight, such defeats made him do what his ego would have never allowed him to do. To admit he's powerless and to let God do for him what he could not do for himself. Resurrect life from the experiences that in the moment he thought were death. You see, Paul can boast in these experiences that exposed his powerlessness because through Jesus, he recognizes that they have somehow, some way been turned upside down, been transfigured into these painful but necessary ego deaths that forced him to do the one thing he would never choose to do on his own, which is to finally and fully lay himself down and to surrender to God's will. That's why Paul says we can rejoice in defeat, because y'all, through it, we have this great upside down opportunity to finally learn what it means to surrender to a power greater than ourselves, and to learn that God's grace and power are truly sufficient for us, so long as we let it be. That's the first step towards abundant life, y'all. Jesus, Paul, the 12 steps, they all understand that it begins here, that all spiritual transformation must start with this simple but not easy admission. I'm powerless over blank, and my life is unmanageable. And that's true, because think about it. Without it, we won't really, truly surrender, not fully to God. Instead, what we do, without this step, we'll keep gripping onto our own willpower, at least in some small way. We'll keep trying and relying upon our own strength, attempting to engineer our own transformation, our own healing, our own salvation, creating not newness, but usually just better disguised egos, addictions, and sins, which y'all seems obvious. Without this admission, without relying on something outside of ourselves, what are we going to do? Well, we're going to keep trying to solve the problems that our current broken ways of thinking and living helped create, with the exact same broken ways of thinking and living that helped create them. And that's insanity. Why on earth would my brain, which broke my life, have the solutions to the brokenness of my life? Does anyone think that actually makes sense? Of course not. And yet, despite the obviousness of this fact that we don't have the answer to our own problems, this first step, y'all, it's so hard. Because admitting that I cannot rely upon my own will or my mind to fix myself, to get myself where I want to go, y'all, that feels like dying. That admission of defeat, of utter defeat, violates everything we're taught by our culture and its obsession with power and control. Not to mention, it violates everything that we want to hear. No one wants to be told that the solution to your problem is dying to who you think you are. No one wants to be told that our egos would rather kill us than cry uncle, admit defeat, and change. And yet, all evidence proves that to be true. And yet, Jesus stated definitively that surrender and ego death were absolute requirements for those who wish to be his disciples. Pick up your cross, follow me. You want to live, you got to die. And he knew this, because what he understood fundamentally is that without that, we would never let go enough of our own will to follow his into something into abundant life. Why would we? Because, to quote Richard Rohr, until you bottom out and come to the limits of your own fuel supply, there's no reason for you to switch to a higher octane of fuel. Why would you? You will not learn to actively draw upon a larger source until your usual resources are depleted and revealed as wanting. In fact, you will not even know that there is a larger source until your own resources fail you. Until and unless there is a person, situation, event, conflict, or relationship that you cannot manage, you will never find the true manager. That's it. That's step one. That's why all spiritual transformation must begin with this admission of powerlessness. Usually first over just one uncontrollable thing, one unmanageable relationship, substance, suffering, failure, loss, habit, death, or circumstance. One thing where no matter how hard we try, we cannot change what's happened. One thing that forces us to admit defeat, that we're not in control, that we're powerless over it, which then reveals what's always been true. Again, that we are powerless over everything else too. That we've never been able to control anything outside of ourselves, and even that, y'all, we control maybe half the time at best. Simply put, for our brokenness and ego deaths and experiences of failure and weakness to become pathways to healing and resurrection, y'all, we got to do one thing first, and that is we must admit with 100% clarity that we are powerless. Otherwise, we'll never surrender. And I won't ask y'all to go somewhere that I won't. I have no interest in being a pastor on a pedestal. And frankly, I trust that this community can be okay knowing that their pastor is a broken human being just like you. And I guess it's probably better to pose that as a question. Can y'all handle that? Can y'all handle the fact that I am by no means perfect, that I have made mistakes, that I have failed, that I am a human being like you? Yes or no? Good. Because I've been forced to admit I'm powerless, particularly over alcohol. And I told you all last week about my first drink, so it made a kind of sick sense that today I would tell you about my last drink. You see, like most, I spent my 20s refining my ego. This image of Mike Overstreet, this image of myself created by my own power. After getting sober from drugs, I'd found Jesus, I'd gotten married, I'd graduated seminary, I became a father, I used my gifts of leadership and charisma and intellect to become a pastor, and not a half bad one at that. Thus, I entered my 30s with plenty of reasons to boast. In this firm faith in my own ability to will myself wherever I wanted to go, which was really helpful when it came to kind of imposing myself on my world, but it also made it easy to ignore realities that, undermined this ego image, that undermined my delusion of control. Like how, despite admitting my drug addiction issues, I continued delusionally believing that alcohol was different. That no, this one drug, I can't control the other ones, but this one, I've got. I can handle this one. Or the fact that my brain chemistry was clearly off. That depression, that old friend of mine, had once again started overtaking me. And no amount of self-medication or just trying harder was going to resolve that. Above all, though, it helped me ignore character defects that had been festering my entire life. Anger and control issues rooted in a fear of suffering and loss, broken relational patterns of manipulation, grounded in believing that people would abandon me if they ever truly knew me. Insecurities that paradoxically got mixed with pride, self-pity, self-loathing, self-centeredness, judgmentalism. I became the most insecure egomaniac you'd ever meet. And all of these, they directed my choices, whether I admitted them or not, which I didn't because my ego told me that I had to deny them at all costs, that to admit such a weakness, such a defeat, y'all, that was death. So instead, I lied to myself as if denial would just make them go away. Spoiler, it didn't. I just got sicker until inevitably my power failed me. You see, before Scott got here to E3, this church had gone through quite a season of hardship, one that left me pretty broken on a personal level, while simultaneously shoving me into this position of being a pastor, trying to guide a hurting, fractured community. On top of which, just as things started to level out, this little thing called COVID struck. And shockingly, all this extra stress and pain and now isolation, well, it didn't miraculously fix me, I know. Crazy. No, it just made my existing brokenness get worse. Slowly but surely, this pattern I developed of social drinking with sporadic binge drinking, well, it progressed into drinking daily, then in higher quantities, then earlier, and then, of course, in hiding. At which point, I knew it was a problem. So I started trying harder, right, to control this compulsion, coming up with all these rules, these great little things like I won't drink liquor, or I'll only drink after 5, or I'll only have 3 beers, or whatever, all while telling people I wanted to drink less. But white knuckling, it didn't work. It turns out that if you created the locks, you know where the keys are. If you created the boundaries, you know how to get past them. No. Every time, very quickly, I just go right back to what I always did, compulsively drinking again, which I, kept justifying by thinking, sure, I drink too much, but hey, at least I'm a good father, a good husband, a good pastor. Still telling myself, I'm in control, despite how increasingly I felt like I was living in this hell where I couldn't imagine going even one more day drinking alcohol, and simultaneously I could not stop drinking alcohol. All of which came to a head that July. See, my daughter Audie, she was about 11 months old at the time, and during her nap, I was playing online games with some friends, which meant, of course, that I needed to grab a drink, because, who's playing online games without a drink? And then another, and then another, until somehow, I don't even know to this day how, I had finished an entire bottle of whiskey. And then I decided, quite sanely, you know what would be good now? I should mow the lawn. In the middle of July, 2 p.m., in Florida's 100-plus degree heat. That's a good idea, right? I'm dehydrated, I'm drunk, so the best thing to do would be to go outside and kill myself, right? Like, let me sweat out every drop of liquid that isn't alcohol in my entire body. After which, as I can imagine, or as you can imagine, I was gone, just completely out of my mind. Though I still somehow miraculously survived the day. That is, until evening when I went to put Audie in the bathtub, and I fell. And thank God, I had the innate wherewithal, the biological, imperative to protect. So I spun, and she didn't get hurt. But I remember lying there in the tub, and she's crying, and my wife's looking at me with just this face of horror and anger and disbelief and disappointment. And suddenly, whatever delusions I had about myself, about Mike Overstreet, about who I was, y'all, about drinking too much, but still being a good father, a good husband, those shattered, along with any faith I still possessed in my own willpower, my own control over the substance, compulsion, anything else, really. It's kind of hard to tell yourself that you're in control, that you're doing great, when you're lying half in a tub holding your crying daughter, drunk out of your mind, as your wife looks at you with despair. It was rock bottom. And y'all, it felt like dying. I was defeated. And no amount of charisma, intellect, strength, or willpower was going to change that. I was forced to admit that I was powerless. That only a power greater than myself, outside of myself, could possibly save me from this hell that my best thinking had created. And a lot's happened since that last dream. The next day, I went to my first remote AA meeting. I started working the 12 steps anew with my sponsor, recognizing I never truly surrendered to them, not fully at least. I began a journey that's included therapy, being prescribed antidepressants, making so many amends, really changing my entire life, and hearing just countless stories from other broken people who, in admitting their powerlessness, came to find recovery and resurrection after what felt like death. Above all, though, in surrender, I began to hear that gentle voice that Paul heard, whispering, "It's okay to fall down. Get up. Go. Not by your own power, but because my grace is sufficient for you. And my power is made perfect in your weakness." Which I now know is true. Because, y'all, that defeat, which I never would have chosen on my own. I mean, who would? Who would want to be that kind of person? No one does. No, but that defeat is what finally made me surrender to this power greater to myself. This God whose vision for my life is far greater than my ego's hells ever could be, who's done more for me than I could ever do on my own. This God who saved me, who has done for me what I could not do for myself. A God I can truly boast about. And y'all, that's my story. That's my first step towards recovery and abundant life. My admission of powerlessness. But let me ask you, what's yours? Because the truth is, I can't work these steps for you. You got to walk them yourself. But let me tell you, if you're sick and tired of being sick and tired, if you're broken and you don't know why, if you're just so exhausted from being stuck in the same cycles that seem to play out over and over and over again, if you just feel stuck, if you feel like you're in that place of dying, then please hear me on this. Y'all, if you want what I have found, then know that there is hope, that there is a way forward, that there is a way out of this hell. And it starts with just one simple but not easy admission. Simple statement. I am powerless over blank, and my life has become unmanageable. For me, that blank was alcohol and drugs. And hey, it might be for you too. But maybe it's not. Maybe it's something different. Some loss, trauma, death, divorce, some mental or physical illness, some person, significant other, child, friend, parent, or maybe it's a behavior. Overworking, gambling, spending money, eating, lying, cheating, sex. I don't know. But what I do know is that there's something. And if you're ready to admit defeat, then I promise you that there is a God who, on the other side of surrender, has the power to help you fall upwards out of the hell that you're living in and into freedom and abundant life. Whatever it is, though, I invite you today to bring that admission of powerlessness to the Lord's table, where we symbolically remember how on a cross Jesus took our sins, brokenness and pain into himself and overcame them. Not by our power, not by our merit, but by his grace, by his self-sacrificial love, which, y'all, is a power so much greater than ourselves. At E3, all are welcome to participate in the sacrament of communion. So I invite you to come as you feel led, to take a cup of juice and some gluten-free bread and to reflect as we take these elements and remember Christ's story, to ask ourselves, where do we need to admit our powerlessness so that by grace we can take our first step towards healing, liberation, and abundant life. Come, the table is open.